So last week I tried Sophy AI, which is a ChatGPT competitor in Gran Turismo 7. And I'm not good at sim racing yet. I want to be. It's one of my side projects that I really want to grow into becoming proficient simulation racer of some kind. And I noticed that when I actually took my 430 out on the track when I raced it for Banging Gears was how close and how familiar it felt when I was out there on the track and I was driving. So today I wanted to jump into my experience running the standard class on Sophy AI in Gran Turismo 7. We started at the racetrack that I despise the most when it comes to video games because the apexes are very, very weird. And as I jumped into this, I wanted to tell myself one thing. Number one, drive as if it was your actual car. Number two, don't be a dick, which is really easy to do to AI or competitors that aren't real human beings, especially in video games. So to jump into a car that was front wheel drive, the Type R, it felt really good. For the most part, it actually was a really competitive driving experience. And I didn't know what to expect with the ChatGPT equivalent, but man, it was actually really fun. By the time I had gotten into the final lap at Tsukuba circuit, I'd found myself actually battling it out with these cars. So much so that I felt a little bit bad because on the entry, I think in this section too, I ended up bumping into Sophy a couple times. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to win using a nice clean race and a nice clean lap. The only reason I managed to actually get ahead of Sophy in this race was because I exited late to get the speed up for the straight, which just got me a little bit of an edge around the last corner. And I ultimately ended up getting into first place. I tried these runs both without the systems and at the advanced level, and I could not do it. It was way too hard. And so when I got into the second series with the 92, but it was an R32, it was modified all-wheel drive, and I was competing against some relatively fun front-wheel drive cars on this track. Now, I really enjoy this track, mostly because a lot of the times you're using the brakes to get around these corners as fast as humanly possible. So you're not just slamming on the brakes and then going right onto the gas. You have to use a little bit of throttle steering to get through these corners that have elevation changes. And because I'm on a sim rig and not just using a controller, I feel that weight shift just a little bit differently. And a lot of times when I was racing with this car specifically, I couldn't really get down the weight transfer of this car. It constantly felt like I just didn't have enough steering angle, constantly. And I don't know, again, if I was throwing myself into the corners too hard, because when I was in second place, I found myself just battling as defensively as I possibly could, so much so that when Sophy came in on the final turn of lap 1, when she passed me, there was no way I was going to get that back. I have a really big issue with chasing in games. When a car is in front of me, I have this tendency to chase. It's a behavior I'm trying to get rid of is what I'm really trying to do. And that correction in how I drive is not apparent in this race. By the time I had gotten through this lap, I was trying my best to just keep up with Sophy because I figured that as an all-wheel drive platform, I have more power than the rest of the people on this field, so to speak. Sophy was the only one in a comparable car that I could at least get ahead of some of these other cars that couldn't keep the traction down in the turns. Turns out, my braking zones were so wonky and so bad, especially around some of these wide arching turns, that I couldn't carry any speed to make me more competitive than these other cars. I ended up coming through the final stretch of the second lap, sitting in what felt to be fourth place, which was insanely disappointing when you consider the fact that I'm not even in an advanced line of cars. I'm in the standard competition, and I ended in fourth. The third one that I was able to race that I really enjoyed was with the Corvette. Now I tried running this too without any of the traction control systems on the car, and the car would not turn. So I had to run this race with traction control at a very minimal setting, ABS at a very minimal setting, but no sort of assistance anywhere else in this track. In that first corner when you're coming through the tunnel, the thing that I learned very quickly about this car in this game was how much braking input is needed while you're actually giving it steering as well. It's not a car that seems to feel like you can keep grip on it without also having some weight on the front axis. I noticed that when I was driving the C8 version of this car at Ron Fellows, we were driving through the track and I remember having to spend so much time nannying the brakes in the front to keep what felt like the weight that was non-existent on the front axle, which made turning really, really hard. It was a problem that sometimes I felt should have just been a mid-engined car problem, at least with the C8. But when I got behind the wheel in the 430, I realized that that wasn't the case with that car at all. The steering input was right there, but I felt more on top of the wheels in the 430 than the C8. But we're not driving a C8, we're driving the C7, which carried a ton of speed around all of these corners. And what I always felt really good about this race was, for the most part, it was very, very clean. Sophy was right behind me in the second lap. We were both using as much of the track as humanly possible. And what I was really trying to get comfortable with was how the car felt under steering and also braking in some of these zones. You can see it as I was coming through the straight. Sophy was right on my the entire time. But because she ran right in front of me as fast as humanly possible, I was able to kind of get the inside line coming through the straight, and it got a little competitive. She actually knocked me around on that final turn, which was interesting because apparently this AI is more fancy than, you know, a typical competitor. And so when you start driving very aggressively around the car and you get close to it, a lot of times it does fight back. And you can see that she did fight back. Ultimately pulled away, got first on this one, but I definitely think it has to do with the speed. Now the final track lap against Sophy, this was super tough. This was an incredibly difficult race because I have to be honest, I didn't win it cleanly the first time. So I went back to it to do it again. And that was my greatest goal. I wanted to try and see if I can get into first place with the sim rig, clean laps, not doing anything too bullish, and just driving it right. Switching from a Corvette to a Supra, to an R32, to the car, the Integra that we ran in the first lap, it was a lot of change, which made it very difficult to stay consistent in what I thought was gonna be my driving behavior as I was running through these tracks. For the most part, I made one really big mistake in the first lap. I ran off the track. A lot of that had to do with me thinking that I could push my braking zone going before the straight. The answer was that I couldn't. But nevertheless, I still managed to get into first place before the end of the first lap was over. My favorite part of this track is the chicane. It's that small little chicane before you go into the straight and you go into the second lap. That was probably my favorite part. From here, my biggest goal is just trying to practice the line coming through this. You actually don't need to be on hard of the throttle as you think. That does not make any sense. But what I'm trying to say is when I run on a sim rig, at least when I started, I wanted to mash the gas and mash the brake as hard as possible all the time. When I started racing in real life, I wanted to do the same because the way that they taught me to race was, hey, drive it as hard as possible and then brake really hard and then go on the gas again. Well, that works-ish until you actually start trying to practice with the inputs of the car. You need to give everything a certain limit point with the braking and the gas so that you can maximize the speed and you can maximize the tire usage around every single track that you can. So the sim rig's been a really great way for me to practice that. And if you've been on the fence of getting a sim rig, I would recommend it. It's a ton of fun. But it's not always a game. What I've realized, especially as I was doing this, was that I was actually getting pretty into it. I was getting pretty serious about wanting to get better, wanting to do it right, and I treated it more as a sport rather than I treated it as just like a sideline activity. And that's how I've really started to jump into some of these things. It's not it's not just something that I'm doing casually. Maybe that's just the Martinez in me, but I want to do well and I want to get good at it. And so when I ran off the track at the end of lap 3 and I saw Sophy get in front of me, I was upset because this was a 3-lap event. It was the final race and I really thought that I had it, and because I went late into that braking zone, I completely missed the mark. I don't know what happened there, but Sophy braked late because I was right behind her. She ran off the track. I don't think I tapped her and I got back into first place. Not essentially the win that I was hoping for. Definitely not a feeling of fulfillment of seeing that happen because I was really hoping for a close final lap with Sophy here on this track. It was an absolute blast. I was able to secure first place in that final one. So we ended up getting first in the first race, fourth in the second race, and then we ended up coming back through for first on the last 2 as well. So overall, a really fun experience. Let me know what tracks or laps you want to see me do in Gran Turismo, and I will give it my best shot. I'm Alex, AlexMartini with 2 underscores on Instagram, and we will see you later. Adios.